Welcome, everybody. On behalf of LIPA, NELLCO, and NELLCO, I want to welcome you to Data Visualization Fundamentals Part 2. Our speaker today is again going to be Amanda Karel. She is the project manager for the NELLCO Law Library Consortium. She works on the All-Star Benchmarking Project and specializes in data collection, analysis, assessment, and surveying. She has also served as the Strategic Planning Project Manager at the University of Washington School of Law and is co-owner of AKR Consulting. She has extensive experience with assessment and data visualization. And with that, I will pass it over to Amanda.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining for the second part of this webinar. I'm really excited to dive back in. In case you haven't watched the recording from the prior session and you just are trying to remember where we were when we left off, the last time we met, we were working through the data visualization process and talking that through. And the data visualization process really begins step 0 by collecting good data in your library and then figuring out what the message is you want to communicate to your audience. So when you're working on this step 1, when you're trying to figure out what point you want to make to an audience, you want to literally write down the answer to this question in a complete sentence. We're going to use that sentence later in the data visualization process to help inform the visualization that you construct. After you figure out what your point you're trying to make with your audience, you really want to think about what your audience needs in that moment. How will they be engaging with the chart? What kind of data literacy do they have? What is the context that they will be seeing this chart in? Then step 3 is where we left off nearing the end of trying to figure out what the best chart is for presenting your data. And as I said last time, the correct chart is shaped by what you want your audience to focus on or recall later. So the last time we met, when we were talking through types of charts, we talked about these two types of charts, a big single number or a donut chart, if you're trying to help people take away literally one number or 1%. If you want people to look at the data specifically, and that data consists of 3 or fewer percentages, an icon array, which is also called a pictograph, is really good. A pie chart is also an option, but when there's more than 3 categories, you want to stay away from a pie chart. You want to use something like a stacked bar or column. If your percentages are hierarchical in nature, so for example, if you were trying to visualize where your budget spend is or different components of your library's collection, a tree map is particularly helpful, especially if some of your percentages are very small. If you want to show your audience how numbers specifically change over time, the classic option is a line graph, especially when there are 3 or more data points. Slope graphs can be used when there's only 2 points. Because people really can struggle with interpreting angles, you might want to consider using a dot plot or a stacked column instead. Then, if you're thinking about how percentages change over time, a waterfall graph could be really good. These types of graphs use both color and the size of a bar to help visualize the change. The deviation bar graph is another option, and that is used when you have some percentages that are going negative as well as some percentages that are going positive. Today, we're going to pick back up with the charts that are good at helping you make a comparison. And when you're making a comparison to something that maybe it was how things have changed in your own library's history, or an internal goal set by your library, or an external benchmark, both side-by-side columns and overlapping bar charts are really good for those types of comparisons. But to really get some bang for your buck, so to speak, you might want to consider a bullet graph. And that's the type of chart we're going to pick up with next. I really love when bullet charts show up in reports and presentations because they can give really interesting context, but this is not a chart you want to just let loose in the world without an explanation. So I really encourage you to use these if you're going to do a presentation where you can discuss it. It's a handout for a collaborative meeting. So for example, this would be a bullet chart. And this bullet chart shows in the black bar, the number of class sections of 3 different types of legal research electives actually taught in a year. So on this chart, there were 9 sections of advanced legal research taught. The red line on each of these bars indicates the internal goal the library had set for the number of sections they would like to teach that year. The gray bar behind, if you notice, goes from dark to light, and those different variations in gray show what was considered low, medium, or high numbers of sections based on based on the library's historical offerings. So if we're looking at that advanced legal research bar, this past time, there were 3 sections of the course taught. That was 1 class section shy of their target. It was also on the low side for historical performance. And that's because the library considered 0 to 4 sections low, 5 to 8 sections medium, and 9 up to 16 as high. And that's based on their historical data. So as you can see, this is a lot of information really packed into a chart. But you can also see why you would want to have a conversation around this. You're not going to just want to drop it on someone's desk and walk away or send it in an email. And so that goes back to that larger point I was trying to make with data visualizations last time, is these are great for starting conversations, but it is not a substitute for an entire conversation. So next, we're going to talk about how you would present results from a survey. And there are 5 different charts that tend to work particularly well. The first, a bar or a column chart, should be pretty familiar to you. They're pretty standard. Bar and column charts encode data by length, which is really easy for people to interpret, and that's why they tend to work so well. These are particularly good if you have a survey question where people are asked to rank choices or select all that apply to them. When you're putting together a bar or a column chart, you want to order your data from greatest to least. You'll notice that with this chart, I was trying to use color to draw your attention to a point rather than have you look at all the data to reach a similar conclusion as I did. So with this chart, what I did is I put together data from 2 different points, the AALL 2019 State of the Profession Survey that said where law libraries are present on social media. And then I overlaid, hey, according to new research on Gen Z, which are most incoming law students, the social media platforms that Gen Zs are actually on are YouTube and Instagram, and some that weren't even asked about by AALL. So it's a different way to use something very familiar. If you are looking for something to catch people's eye that does the same thing as a bar or column chart, but isn't as visually dense, I really recommend lollipop charts. The nice thing about lollipop charts is it's really helpful when you have a lot of data. So if there's even more social media platforms that were in here, I would have skipped the bar chart completely and just gone straight to the lollipop because it is a lot less visually overwhelming. The downside of building these lollipop charts, particularly in Excel, is they can be a little bit harder to manipulate color. You notice that I failed to get the stems of these 2 lollipops to turn black to try and pull people's attention there. If you're presenting results to questions that are asked on a Likert type index, those questions like rate your level of agreement with this statement from 1 to 5, you might want to consider using a diverged stacked bar if you do not have a neutral middle response option. So if you don't have a neither agree nor disagree or neutral in there. These are really good options because what they do is they put a spine right down the middle and say, hey, when you glance at these options, you can see that people were really leaning more towards the strongly agree side than they were the disagree, strongly disagree. They get a nice sense of the number of responses on each side of agree or disagree without having to really sit and process the numbers associated with each category in the same way. So this helps people get a sense of the distribution pretty quickly. You can also use stacked bar or column charts to really compare the percent of people who agree with a statement on a survey. So here is a fictional data set about law school climate at my imaginary law school with two columns, one for staff and one for administration. However, while we can see that these perceptions aren't lining up between administration and staff, it's really hard to get a sense of how just staff answered or how just administration answered because they're divided from one another. And so a lot of people will drift away from a stacked bar or stacked column chart in these situations and use a back-to-back chart, which is also called a population pyramid when you're trying to help your audience see the shape of the overall data set for one group at a time, while still being able to compare the groups. So you can still very quickly see that the staff and administration's perceptions about the law school climate aren't agreeing, but you can also see very quickly that the staff side are feeling a lot less positive than the administration side. So now that we have gone through a lot of options of charts, that's 20 to be precise if you were keeping count, and you found the chart type that you were hoping to use based on what you're trying to accomplish and what your audience needs, it's really time for the next step in the data visualization process. And this is probably the aspect of data visualization that's the most fun. And that's when you're trying to sharpen the point that you're trying to make. In this step, we're working to add emphasis to your chart and eliminate information that's getting in the way of helping inform that larger message. You don't want to put so much information in there that your point gets missed. You know, it's really tempting when you live in a world that you know a lot about and you have a lot of data available to you, that you want to get all of that data out there. You need to pull back a bit because when you're thinking about data-informed decision-making, what the assumption is under that idea of data-informed decision-making is that decision makers have access to the right data, not every available data set. So you really want to think about how can I make sure that we're visualizing the right thing in the right way that will help people make a decision. And there's a few elements that you can really look at in turn to help sharpen the point of your chart. Your text, your arrangement, the colors you use, the lines that you have in there, and the message you're going to make. And we're going to work through these 5 components so you can really make these visually compelling and meaningful. Keep in mind that each of these elements should really work together to reinforce the overarching answer to that what is the point question. So let's start with text. Overall, charts and graphs should not contain a lot of text. The text that you do use, which typically comes from these 6 sources, titles, subtitles, annotations, data labels, axes labels, and source information, should encapsulate your message and pack a punch. So you're probably not going to use all of these every time. But the one thing you should always have is a title. The title to your chart should be a direct, brief statement that says what your audience should take away. Go back to that sentence you wrote in step 3, because that's the first draft of your message. You want to edit it down to 6 to 12 words and leave it as a sentence. You're not describing the chart, you're just telling people what the takeaway message is. And you want this to be a short title because people, when they are skimming, That is enough to help them comprehend the message, even if they're moving quickly. Also, going against a lot of our training, especially if you are in the social sciences, you want your title left justified at the top, because that's where Western cultures start reading. They don't start reading in the middle of a page. So you leverage convention to your advantage and put your title as a complete sentence in sentence case in the top left. That will grab your audience's attention. You can use subtitles and or annotations to help give additional information about the chart. These can add really nice explanatory or interpretive power. If you want to make a general point about the chart, it makes sense to use a subtitle. If you're trying to highlight a specific data point, using an annotation makes more sense. Annotations are call out text boxes within the graph. So here I added 2 annotations about the modality of law school classes to help the viewer get a sense of the pandemic's impact without having to sit down and think about, oh, what fiscal year did our law school really feel the brunt of the pandemic hit? And that also gives people, with the data I included in those annotations, a sense of the scope of how many people could have had classes face-to-face to even allow for in-person presentations. I chose annotations because these points are about FY21 and 22 data only. If I wanted to change the general message about my chart and make it a little bit more about the pandemic, I could have said something like the COVID pandemic led library personnel to develop innovative digital presentations and put that as a subtitle. And that really would have changed what I wanted people to take away from that chart. If I put that in as a subtitle, those annotations would be useless. So if you're trying to build a chart and you want to use annotations, it's not something that you're going to find as a feature in Excel. You just drop in a text box using the insert function and add it in that way. Let's stay with this example for a little bit longer to help make a few more points about the text. Text on your chart should be hierarchical in size and readable. You notice the title, which I've written as a takeaway sentence, is the largest and the only thing that is in bold. If there was a subtitle, that would be the next largest source of text. Instead, since I don't have a subtitle, the next largest are my annotations, followed by my data labels, then the axes label. The smallest piece of information is the source information. It can be helpful when you're trying to figure out what your font sizes should be to work backwards from your smallest. And so the smallest should always be source information. If it's a chart you're going to print, you're going to want to put that smallest font at 9-point font, unless you know something about your audience and their visual needs, where you might need to set it bigger, but the smallest should always be 9-point font. Size is one factor in readability. The anatomy of the font also highly impacts readability. Researchers at Tableau, a business intelligence, data visualization and statistics company, really recommend, if you are working in tables and numbers, to use either Trebuchet or Veranda for those as your primary fonts. If you are not a big fan of those two, other fonts that Tableau recommends are Arial, Georgia, Tahoma, Times New Roman, and Lucinda Sans. Next, when you're working with a chart, you want to make sure that all of your text is horizontal. Excel and other automatic graph design software will frequently put things on slants, or even worse, they'll make it vertical to make it fit. You do not want your audience to have to twist their head or twist their paper to read it. It should be very readable and very easy for them to access. So that means either you need to edit your text or force the system to make it all horizontal. Sometimes the easiest way to do that is to just change the orientation of your chart. So make something go from a column, where here it automatically dropped my axes labels onto a slant, by changing it from a column chart to a bar chart. Now everything is horizontal and a lot more readable. Going back to this line chart, you may have noticed when you were looking at this chart that I had labeled all of the data directly. Each point of the graph has the exact number of presentations for that year. The other options for how to lay that out is to just label the minimum number and the maximum number if you're trying to get people to better understand the sense of a change over time. Some people also will just label the start point and the end point for each line. It really depends on what kind of information you are trying to communicate in that moment. If you're working with a chart that requires a legend, make sure that you place that legend at the top under your title and the subtitle. That's information people need to have immediately to interpret your chart, and that's why you want it up top. They shouldn't have to look around the page to try and figure things out. If I had had more space, because I wasn't trying to cram it on a PowerPoint slide and have text on the left-hand side, I would have actually embedded the legend within the chart and eliminated it completely. And I would have done that by adding in text boxes at the end of each line that just says, hey, here's the total line, this is the digital line, this is the in-person line. That leads to an even cleaner looking graphic. By labeling each line, I eliminated that eye movement back and forth between the lines and the legend. And by eliminating that eye movement, I increased the brain's capacity to actually interpret and take in the data. To label each line directly, I needed to hide the legend in Excel and then just use text boxes to set them in right next to each other. And just to try and drive home my point about how annoying legends can be, here is an example. Never mind the fact that this is a 3D chart and that's distorting the data. You never want to use a 3D chart. But why they didn't directly label the categories on the x-axis and used a legend, I really can't comprehend. Maybe their thought was this is a depressing topic, so we should make it harder for people to engage and give them a distraction. That's the only rationale I can come up with. So direct label your data whenever possible, directly label your categories, eliminate eye movement as much as possible, and really use that text that you do put in there to your advantage to drive things home, not to be a distractor. The next big point of your chart that you need to consider is arrangement. Improper arrangement of graphs elements can really confuse audiences at best and mislead them at worst. By arranging things thoughtfully, you make data visualization easier to interpret. This is particularly true if you have multiple visualizations within a document. The first big part of arrangement is making sure that your data has not been distorted, that there are accurate proportions represented. Your audience should be able to measure the length or area of a graph with a ruler and find that it matches the relationship that underlies the data. So the distance between FY21 and 22 in our line graph should be the same as the distance from FY20 to 21. You can't manipulate that to make the spike look bigger, for example. These distortions are particularly important to avoid when you're working with pie charts and tree charts, but they're not the only types of graphs that can be distorted. This graph from Wedding Wire truly boggles my mind because they really had to actively battle against their software to make these bars so out of proportion. 39% relative to 12%, that doesn't add up. Somehow 2% looks just barely bigger than 1% as opposed to double. Or here, with these circle charts, distortions can happen if you're looking and working off the wrong element. Here, the data is technically correct because it's the percent of the diameter of the chart, but people read these charts based on the size of the circle's area, not diameter. And let me tell you, circle charts really get people in trouble, especially when they start hacking away at the size of the circle. Fun activity. When you get a copy of these slides, I challenge you to turn this into a full circle pie chart in a way that makes the chart areas match the percentages. And this chart came out of an academic institution that really should have known better. So everybody makes mistakes, but arrangement is something to look at very, very carefully. Is your proportions matching what they should be in your data? The next component is something that I keep harping on and I keep saying over and over again. You're only going to use a 2D chart because 3D charts automatically distort data. But also arrangement of your axes is also very important. This, or when we think about axes arrangement, it's generally focused on where the axes should start. Generally, the x-axis or on a bar or the y-axis on a column chart should start at 0. There is leeway with other types of charts like line charts. So for example, a stock market ticker should not start at 0, otherwise we wouldn't be able to see a pattern. So here you can see Netflix yesterday, this is how they were doing. $275 was the baseline of that stock ticker. If you do have multiple charts on the same document and it's a situation where those charts would invite comparison across them, you really need to make sure that they are on the same axes. Otherwise, it can really distort people's conclusions. So here the AP put together 2 charts from the CDC right on top of each other. And if you glance at the way they're stacked, people will start making comparisons. And at first glance, it doesn't really look like anything is off. I missed it initially, but when you really look at it, how is 42.8% almost as wide as 76.5? There's a scale shift between the race and ethnicity chart and the age chart. And unless you're really looking at the data, someone just glancing at this might come away with the message that the risk of death for pregnant people is pretty much the same for people over 40 as it is for Black people. Checking scale also applies to multiple pie charts, but that's harder to do. Here, just by trying to make the circles look the same size so they're visually appealing, now the data has been distorted, so it looks like 23% is larger than 33%. So you've got to be really careful when you're using multiple visuals on the same document, because people are going to automatically look at those visuals and they're going to glance and try and make these comparisons in their head. So if scale is shifting, you're going to get into trouble pretty quickly. The next aspect of arrangement is how do you order your data? When you're trying to think about putting data in an order intentionally, it's going to depend on what kind of data you're working with. So if you're doing frequency counts of nominal data, that is categorical data that doesn't have a number or ranking associated with it. So how are public law schools performing compared to private law schools would be an example of nominal data. In those situations, you're going to want to order your data from greatest to least in your visual. Other types of charts, use something logical that people will understand, alphabetical, follow time order. Remember that chart that I showed you where they started running the x-axis backwards over time and how confusing that is? Just really think about your data and do it logically. Keep your charts free from decorations. Don't put clip art or decorative illustrations. Everything in there should contribute to the data. Here, adding additional icons like CNN did really cluttered up the visual and can hide important information. Here, it's hidden. There's so many visuals that you miss the little footnote that says people could answer more than once, which is why the whole circle is more than 100%, which also indicates, by the way, that this is not the correct chart type. This should have been a bar chart or a lollipop chart, in addition to having problems with too much clutter. I've pointed out color a few different times when going through some of these charts with you, because you should be really intentional in your color scheme and use color to help people interpret your data. Sometimes this is really subtle. Like in this presentation, I have been changing the slide title colors based on where we are in the presentation. So when you have a copy of the slides, it should be easier for you to navigate through them. Other times, you're going to want to use the color of your visuals will be driven by the brand of your institution. So go to your marketing department's website and find the hex or RGB codes so you can match your charts to your school's colors. When picking a color, keep in mind that color does have cultural connotations. In the United States, pink is considered feminine, for example. Green is associated with positivity. Red is associated with negativity. I really like the website Color Brewer. If you're trying to find a color scheme or additional colors that could work with your brand colors, this website, it's meant for cartographers, for maps. But it will also, you can use it very quickly to do a check on, are these colors together good for colorblindness? Or how do these colors reprint in black and white? So color really is about more than making your chart look nice. It can really impact people's attention, and it can be really, really distracting at the same time, sometimes incredibly negatively, like labeling something as blue and putting it with a red bar. So be intentional in that color. Use it to highlight key patterns or direct your viewers' attention. If the data is less important or it's supporting or comparison data, use a muted color for that, like gray, like I did here. If I had wanted to go a step further with really trying to draw the connection between the title and the color scheme, I should have made the words preferred by Gen Z red to match the bars I was using. Problem with that is it looked alarming, and that's why I made the choice not to. So think about what kind of color connotations there might be, and would that tie be too much? But that's a really subtle way, by changing the color in your title of just specific words in your title, to draw the connection into your chart and help people learn how to interpret it without having to say, and here's what I did and why I did it. The next big component that I want to look at are lines. Excessive lines on a chart, like grid lines, borders, tick marks, and axes, really can add clutter or noise to a graph. When you're building graphs and charts in something like Excel or Canva, they automatically seem to turn on all the lines. So you're going to have to spend some time eliminating lines that aren't useful for interpreting the data. For example, if you have your data directly labeled, you don't need grid lines. The data labels can also allow you to remove the axes. I don't have a y-axis on this graph because I told you 170, 107, 63. I also don't have any grid lines because the exact number is there. No one needs to like glance across to try and figure out how many is that. If you must have grid lines, they should be very muted. A faint gray, do not use black. Also, do not put borders around your graph. Your graph should bleed into the surrounding page or slide. You want to leverage the white space that you have available to you to help people process the data. In case you need convincing, this chart has dark grid lines, and it's pretty distracting. And makes the grid lines look a lot more important than they really are. Here's the same chart with the grid lines muted and the border removed. It's much more pleasing visually. So no borders, light grid lines if you're not labeling your data directly. Now message. As we talked about the last time we met, graphs catch viewers' attention. So you should only visualize the data that needs attention. Too many graphics of unimportant information actually dilutes the power of visualizations. Keep in mind, not everything needs to be visualized. Keep asking yourself, does this chart connect to your point? This also connects to step 3 in the visualization process. What is the best chart type? Pop quiz if they really felt the need to visualize the number of syrup-related crimes in 2012. What type of chart should they have used? One big number. They just needed to do one big number here. No pun intended on the 1 and the 1. When you're creating your chart, really think about what level of precision is needed to meet your audience's needs. Charts intended for public consumption rarely need p-values listed, for example, if you're statistically minded. It is a hard habit to break. Few numeric labels really need decimal places. So unless you're speaking with academic peers, you can probably back off on the level of precision. You remember that analysis of the Rickroll that I showed early on? Besides being the wrong type of chart, I mentioned earlier that the creator of this graph takes the data to the hundredths place. When you do that, you imply a level of data analysis that may not be possible or probable. Do we really think that the graph creator sat with a stopwatch while the song played and really got down to the millisecond to time how much of the song focused on saying goodbye or making you cry? It was the pandemic, so maybe. But similar issues to this come up with survey data. If we say an average score on a 5-point scale was 3.25, that goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree, that's implying a way that our participants probably weren't really thinking about the data when they took that survey. They probably weren't sitting there going, well, you know what, I'm a 4.37 on my level of agreement. So think very hard about, do you need to go to the hundredths place? Probably not. Maybe you don't even need to go to a decimal point at all. Just because you can be precise doesn't mean you should. We probably don't need to know spending in an annual report down to the penny. We probably don't need to know shelving space down to the 1/8 of an inch. Ask yourself, do people really need to be this far in the weeds to make the decisions that we're hoping they'll be able to use this data to inform their choice on? Finally, you really want to step back from your chart and make sure that all of the things that you've been looking at, that all of the elements of the design are working together. There are a lot of things to look at to ensure that you are answering the question you asked or sending a really clear message. It starts with having good data in the right chart, but it really goes down to a carefully edited look to ensure that that layout is really effective. So let's use chat and fix a chart together. Let's say that you were planning a conference and you're going to have a meeting with your planning committee and you want to submit a final catering order based on data you collected from a survey to potential registrants. I intentionally picked a very silly example to help you focus on the elements of the chart. So this was my first pass at visualizing this survey data. You tell me, jump in chat, what's wrong with this chart? Don't hold back. What are you noticing? And I'm going to take a second to try and find my chat box that has been hidden from me. Okay, finally found it. Yes, need to remove 3D. Colors are too similar. We have angle at play. Hate the pattern. Annoying patterns. Instead of using solids, we have a legend. The horizontal axis is incredibly confusing. Labels are confusing. Oh yes, so many things. Anything else jumping out at you? it only goes to 25%. Bars are not hierarchical, right? They're not organized in a logical way from greatest to least. What do you think the message is of this chart? Yeah, the size of the legend is hard to read. The size of the bars are incredibly misleading. Oh yeah, someone with red-green color blindness, they're not going to be able to read this chart very well. Okay, so what would you say is the takeaway if you're looking at this? What should we order? Can you very quickly glance at this and make a decision? Nope, thank you. Maybe eggs. Okay, we've got to vote for eggs. Now, it's probably a lot harder to get to that than what it should be, right? So you brought up almost everything that I had a problem with. It actually kind of hurt me to make this chart. We've got grid lines. We've got a border around it. We're using a legend instead of direct labels. If I do need a legend, it's in the wrong spot. It should be up here around the top. But the biggest problem, honestly, in my mind, is there's a terrible title on this chart. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So here's a cleaned up version. I've made it, it's no longer a 3D chart. We've got the data displayed in descending order. I've directly labeled the data. So you can see that this is eggs because the bar is literally labeled eggs. To do that, by the way, I just put a text box on top of that bar. I don't need a legend anymore. I've got numeric labels on each of these. So people no longer need axes or grid lines or tick marks. So we're down a whole bunch of lines. I tried to use color to draw a connection between the title and to highlight action where action should be taken. So people seem to prefer protein because eggs and bacon. But we've got a problem with some of our attendees are probably going to zonk out in our conference because they're not eating breakfast. I also took away the border. It bleeds into the rest of the slide. So there's a lot of white space to let people's eyes rest so they can process and really stay focused where it needs to be. So you've sharpened your message. What is the next step in data visualization? Proofread, proofread, proofread. Some things you really should be able to catch with careful proofreading. I really recommend you check your labels and your data. Otherwise, one day you might show up in a slide about the fundamentals of data visualization. I mean, really check them both very, very carefully. I don't know how 4,049 cases is that much smaller than 2,926, but hey, in case I haven't made my point about proofreading, here's a third example where no is coded as red at 90%. They got their colors on their legend mixed up. And truly, after you proofread, the best thing you can do is test your visualizations. Find people who are not intimate with your data to look at your visualizations and ask them questions. What are you noticing? What stands out? What questions do you still have? What point do you think I'm trying to make? While I imagine we don't want to throw drafts of visuals out online, there is something to be said about finding your snarkiest colleague and have them look it all over and offer feedback. Sometimes though, online is great for geography from 1948 on a data blog. People immediately started noting the issues present by color, that each state is lined with an impenetrable wall of swine and we are trapped. I must admit, I giggled for a little bit. I also saw this one not too long ago on the same data critique blog that had this comment that linear time is things like Tableau that have these automatic visuals. So if you're trying to put together some of these visuals on your own and you're using this information that I gave you today as a guide, um, there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to build these visualizations. Excel is where a lot of people head first. And if you have your data in Excel and you go to insert chart on that insert ribbon, there are a lot of the charts that we talked about during this webinar that are pre-programmed into Excel. You can automatically do column bar